Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be looking at Act 1 of Arcane Season 2. We kick it off with episode 1 titled Heavy is the Crown, something that they did a fantastic job of throughout all of their promotion, which was a lot. They were very good about keeping from us who survived the attack on the council, which led to a lot of theorizing, predicting, and they gave you just enough of voices from season 1, as well as hints of certain characters that we knew were going to be in season 2 for us to speculate. But they didn't waste any of our time in establishing immediately who survived that attack. So we see right away that Caitlyn's mother has unfortunately been killed in this. We do see a few other council members have either also passed away or have been injured. And we see that Mel and Jace, while safe, Mbessa is absolutely using this as an opportunity to try and gain power, which we'll get to that a little bit later. I do want to go in order of the scenes as they occurred. The opening was, I think, done so incredibly, where even though so many of us, I think, were so captured by the tragedy that was the very end of season 1, and you felt so strongly for Jinx and some of these interpersonal relationships, the gravity of the attack on the council and the weight of it and the way that extends into all of Piltover, the fear that it establishes, all of that was captured phenomenally. Part of the reason that it really pulls is that there is a frame where it shows people coming in to try and help pick up the pieces, help those who are injured, and the way that it's framed and the way that the colors are done, it almost is identical to the opening scene of season 1 with Jinx and Vi as they are navigating the aftermath of an attack on the undercity, and it is the same sort of color choice, it's the same sort of muted but disturbing shade of red, and you see sort of these people coming through the thick of everything. So to have that be a mirror, first it happened in the undercity, and that's sort of what made you feel connected to the characters. You understood that they have been harmed, that they didn't have anything to do with what happened, yet here we are. And it has that same sort of situation, but now we're seeing it with Piltover. These cycles of violence, I don't want to call it a trope, but the themes that we see in a lot of stories when they tackle these sorts of things, even though we're aware of the idea of cycles of violence, I think that Arcane doesn't just capture that with the individual characters and the way that when they lash out, it causes pain to someone else. While yes, they utilize that really well, they're also really exceptional at making you feel, just in general, how unsettling violence is on all fronts. The memorial scene that follows this is so great. I'm getting a little ahead of myself though. I do want to say before we get to that, I knew that Victor was going to be fine, as far as I knew he would be alive, so maybe fine's not the right word for it, but I knew he was, it's not like his character was through with. But I will say, in that opening, I'm like, okay, but where's Victor? Jace essentially breaking down, rushing him to the lab to try and save him, I was gutted. And I think that what's been done with Jace within this first act has been incredible, because I'm not necessarily somebody who loves Jace. If you have watched my deep dives of season 1, I think he's a phenomenally written character and a very realistic one, but he also can be very irritating. I'm also getting ahead of myself with his character though. We'll get to more Jace dissecting as we progress, but the opening I was really floored by with how good it was. It was everything I was hoping for, and actually I would say exceeded my expectations. And to have this moment followed by the grief that collectively is being felt by Vi, wondering what are we going to do now, by Caitlyn, her father, the way you see him off to the side. You have these individual characters be at the center of your attention, but you still recognize that this is affecting everyone, and to have it not be as crisp as we typically get, to have certain colors muted, all of that I think was such an artistic way to reflect what the characters are feeling in this moment. Within the opening scene, I also was wondering if we were going to see this, and I was glad to see it was happening instantly, which is Mbessa basically taking over. Obviously, this is a character that is pretty much willing to do whatever she has to do for her goals, and one of those things does entail protecting her family. So to see her taking charge in this moment, I think it's very easy to interpret it as she's just doing what needs to be done because she's a character that's used to authority and having people listen to her, and also she's trying to protect her daughter. While true, I also just think it's in her nature to capitalize on any situation, and I think this moment is a hybrid. She genuinely cares about being there for Mel, but also, and we see this throughout the progression of this arc here in this first act, she is going to be taking over. So I love that that detail was put in to that scene immediately. After a little bit of time has passed, we do see that the remaining council members are trying to band together to determine what they're going to do in retaliation. And I did note that the one particular individual refers to them as creatures, the creatures that did this. And so already you're seeing the way that despite the fact that they do chime in and Mel sort of takes Caitlyn's side and saying this was the attack of one individual, this isn't something all of the Undercity is responsible for. Despite that, you are seeing the way that very quickly we're starting to once again go right back to deciding that everybody within the Undercity is not really human, that they're not worthy of compassion, that they are all collectively responsible and thus they deserve collective punishment, which is repeating what we saw happen at the very beginning of season 1 when we had Vi inadvertently cause, and Jinx, you could say Powder at the time, they inadvertently caused a little bit of harm, and that was met with such a chaotic reaction on the council's part. So if they were willing to go that far from that moment, the idea of this catastrophe, you can only imagine the scope of their retaliation, but Mel and Caitlyn do somewhat manage to rein them in, and they decide that, yes, based off of Mbessa's input, we should probably have a united front, but we're not going to use Hex Tech. We're not going to use Hex Tech weapons. And you do see that Mel, in part, is doing this to honor Victor and Jace's wishes, that they do not want to have those weapons used. Leading up to the memorial, we do have a scene between Vi and Caitlyn, and I did think it was notable that Caitlyn, you even see in her posture as she's going through a lot of her documents, she's very upright and she's trying very hard to keep it all together and be proper. You see her trying to sort of also be, in a way, caring for her father, who at this point has allowed himself to be somewhat disheveled and he's just settling into his grief. But Caitlyn's trying to keep it all together. And then when she does have her interaction with Vi, you see her basically crying in her arms, and Vi is being there for her. And Caitlyn, though, has this mistaken idea that Vi is almost in a way going to be her champion. This fight between them is very realistic because you can understand why Caitlyn would feel like Vi would be on our side, wouldn't she? After all this has happened, I can't imagine she would turn away. But Vi is also like, okay, but these are the people who killed my parents. I don't want to represent what they represent. I don't want to be one of them. Very realistic, and both characters are coming to that exchange with their own way of looking at their world and their perception of things that are ultimately, I think, really well done. We also see Jace trying to contemplate what is going on with Victor as the Hex Core is keeping him alive, but it's not really doing a whole lot else and he can't really keep up with how quickly it's progressing. I will say the symbolism of him holding Victor's cane I thought was so touching, and seeing that he is finally at a place where he really recognizes this particular conversation he has with Mel, where he says something along the lines of, I don't understand. I was right there next to him, so why was I able to just stand up and walk away, whereas this is what's happened to Victor? And obviously that's true of this particular moment, but I also think that in a way that sort of captures a lot of Jace and Victor's, not just their interactions, but the way that the world sees them and the circumstances of their lives. Jace has, in pretty much every situation, been able to get by, whereas Victor has had to persevere through so much. And Mel has a line where she is basically saying sometimes things are just up to chance. I think this was a fantastic turn for Jace's character that I'm looking forward to seeing progress throughout the rest of the season, as he is a character that I think has not necessarily quite seen this fact of life, is that, yeah, there's unfairness across the board. He has always kind of looked at things through what he's experienced, and he often has a difficult time looking outside of himself. He's accidentally selfish, but he's not trying to gain things from any given situation. He does have good motives. He's just not really done the work to see how situations affect other people. So for him in this moment, I think to finally settle in and have this realization that why is life so unfair? The amount of misfortune that others experience, while it is in this situation reduced to just him and Victor, I think this is going to be really transformative for Jace's character moving forward. We also see Caitlin reflecting on past experiences with her mother, where she goes to visit this particular very beautiful place. I think the way that this was animated was absolutely gorgeous. But within this moment, when she's sort of just sitting and by herself, she does have this almost hallucination in a sense, where she sort of just drifts off and she imagines that through all these petals, there's Jinx there and she's taking the shot. Something I want to compliment about this show is that there are a lot of various ways that characters are experiencing their trauma and their pain. And I think the one that's the most forward is how Jinx experiences her pain in season 1. It is also very artistically done, but I think captures what she's experiencing and sort of the chaos within her mind exceptionally. And here, I actually think that we see a other side of the coin. So much of what Jinx has got is so disoriented, whereas Caitlin's character is somebody who she starts to lose sight of everything around her and just locks in on one single thing, which is very tied to the idea of how she uses her weapon and how she just thinks through her problems. But in this moment, to just have everything sort of disappear around her, and yes, there's these little details with the petals themselves, but it's Jinx and that's the only thing she can lock into. It matches her character so incredibly well. There is a line between her and Jace that I noted, which would be Hextech might keep us alive, but it's not what'll save us. I think that this is potentially foreshadowing for the entirety of the rest of this season and the consequences of using Hextech. I also think this is somewhat informed, of course, by other events that occur within these first 3 episodes, but it felt notable even in the moment. And I also think it's a lot more of negative sort of looming foreshadowing, and that it's not just that it's not going to be what saves them. I think it's also going to be what causes so much harm within their society, both Undercity and Piltover. Then we're finally moving into the memorial scene, which was explosive and incredibly intense. There is a small detail that I want to note before we get into the action-oriented parts of this, which is that there's this little girl that's been having a recurring appearance, and I am very curious to see if we're going to learn more about who this person is and how they're connected to these events. And I can't really know that right now, but I am going to keep it in the back of my mind as we move forward. But speaking of moving forward and getting into this memorial scene, I knew as soon as this scene started and we were seeing this character with the veil, I knew immediately who it was. And I knew because not that much time has passed since her son was killed by Jace and this moment. And we also now no longer have Silco making sure that some of the other crime bosses, I'll call them, are being held in check. I just knew as soon as I saw her, because I'm like, who's tall and who has this sort of silhouette? And I was immediately knowing that something was going to happen. So when Vi starts to pick up on things that are suspicious, I was like, oh my gosh, here we go. This is going to spell disaster for any attempts at not going fully against Zahn. But I was so like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? There are a number of phenomenal moments throughout this action scene that I can't really capture because the show captures it all on its own, but I did want to note how much I appreciated, because of the fact that this particular character is motivated by wanting revenge for what happened to her son, and since it was Jace specifically that was the one who, while accidental, he is the one that killed her son. So her being the one to go up against him, they did such a great job of having how she wields her weapon match and mirror almost identically to how Jace uses his weapon. The way that she carries it, the way that she moves with it. I loved that detail. Obviously, you could argue that it's just because both weapons are massive, but I think there was a lot of intentionality with having her use the weapon the way that he does. It was getting me so pumped. It was fantastic. And on top of that, the amount of here comes the cavalry moments throughout this fight when you're seeing that Caitlin is being choked and then Vi enters the picture, or when Jace is hiding and once again Vi enters the picture. You also have these 2 new enforcers that we've been introduced to, one of them named Maddie, who seems like such a ray of sunshine that I'm like, oh, is this character gonna maintain their idealism? I don't think so. But you see them, as soon as the enemy, in this moment anyway, was grabbing her, I was like, oh my gosh, and we don't even know these characters really just yet. And I already was feeling so strongly for them. I was afraid that when the other enforcer was going to protect her, that they would end up being hurt. And then the character that Vi was sort of, you could say, depressed with, that character showing up, and you're like, yes, just so many of these moments. And then when Mbessa entered the picture, I knew immediately she's the one that let them in. Now, they didn't hide it very much. I feel like they kind of really clued you in, because later when they're discussing how could this have happened, they must have had help, because we took every security measure that we could and still they managed to get in. So somebody had to have given them access. I was like, Mbessa. But they also sort of panned to her in that moment, so it doesn't feel like an amazing prediction by any means, but because I've been predicting since season 1 and pretty much the introduction of Mbessa, I was almost positive that she was going to find a way to wedge herself in and either use somebody as a puppet or use the chaos between Zahn and Piltover. I just knew she was going to find a way to seize power where she could. So I instantly predicted that she was the one. And I was like, oh, and it makes perfect sense, because she not only used them, but then she betrayed them, which means nobody can reveal it was her. She stabbed them in the back. Yeah, it's totally her. And so when we get that reveal later, I was like, I knew it. But despite the fact that this scene was quite action-packed and kind of gets you really pumped up, we do now once again see an additional aftermath scene, and Caitlyn is already experiencing so much pain, and she's in a position right now where I think she can't really sift through all of her feelings, but they're there, and the one that she's focusing on right now is just her anger, and how if only she had taken the shot before with Jinx, and how could they do this? You even see her say it was a memorial. And the way they animate her in this moment, she's usually fairly cool, calm, collected, and her movements in this moment feel much sharper than usual, and the way that they have her expression, I put in my notes that she is starting to resemble Jinx a lot. I said, that's exactly what I said. She's starting to resemble Jinx, and then also the fact that she calls them animals. I was very nervous seeing this side of her, because while it is nice to see the way that her and Vi are having each other's back, I just knew that this was going to spell disaster for the two of them, which we'll get to. But we do see within the end of this one that Caitlyn is ready. She's determined, she's locked in, and she has taken Vi's advice, at least in this moment, that you can't launch this entire huge force against all of the undercity. That is not going to go well. We need basically a special task force. And she ends up joining. She is somewhat motivated by what Maddie said to her before, as well as I think the things that transpired within this memorial fight. But I put in my notes that regardless of whether Mbessa had made it happen or not, which again, we do end up seeing this to be the case, but in this exact moment, because I wasn't quite sure yet, I said, did Mbessa make it happen and then kill them? And then I said, regardless, Mbessa is into Caitlyn's anger. Because when Caitlyn comes in and she's like, this is what we're going to do, shut up, respect me, basically, paraphrasing, obviously. When she comes in, Mbessa looks very pleased. And I noted that Mbessa looked pleased. I did not think that Mbessa was going to see what was going on with Caitlyn for what it is, which is an opportunity. I don't know why I didn't figure that that would be the situation, because we already have seen how good Mel is at reading people. Her mother, it's like a masterclass. This moment of Mbessa seeing that anger in Caitlyn. At first, I thought it was just that she kind of dug it, and she sort of digs when characters take control of situations and use their authority. I did not realize it was also her sort of mapping out, how can I pull this particular person and use their anger and their grief to my advantage. But that's exactly what that scene was in hindsight. Phenomenal, so well done. Then the last thing I noted for this episode was how sad it was to see the mug, which says Man of Progress for Jace and everything they stood for, and how much he didn't want to use Hex Tech as weapons, but this is what you're seeing Caitlyn and her task force are going to be using. And Jace just looking defeated, because ultimately, once again, going against what him and Victor stood for. And I do feel really badly for Jace in this moment. Typically, his sort of wishy-washy behavior drives me a little bit up a wall. The fact that he flip-flops so easily. But this is, I think, as a reaction to the fact that he so badly doesn't know what to do when he's looking at his friend who might die, because in this moment he doesn't know what to do. Victor is still recovering. So for him to just be at a complete loss and just sort of hand the reins over to someone else, I think that speaks to, while yes, it's in his character, it also speaks to how much pain he's in, that he wants so badly to stand by these principles, but he just can't. And you do see that when you get Victor coming out of the hex core goop. I don't know really what else to call it. I'm so sorry. That's not a very sophisticated way to describe it. But when they have their argument, basically, once he's recovered, you do see him saying, but you're asking me to have stood by these principles when my friend was dying in my arms. And I appreciate this, the inclusion of this, because it's very raw, and it's something I think is such a human thing, where so many people have these morals that they stick to and these principles, and it's very easy to do that when you never actually have to test them. For him to want this so badly, he wants to turn this new leaf, and he wants to actually be there with Victor, and we can change the world. And you're right, we should have gone back, because you see this conversation at the end of season 1 about the fact that they never actually changed the world for the better. And so he wants to do that, but also he doesn't want to do that at the expense of his friend potentially dying. He doesn't want to see that anymore. So I think it makes his back and forth actually finally feel like something so many of us can connect to, because before his back and forth was sort of just rooted in him being somewhat naive and easily manipulated, and now it's just rooted in pain. As I said a number of times, I am getting a little ahead of myself. We are officially segueing, though, into episode 2. This one is titled Watch It All Burn. It opens with finally us seeing Jinx. We have been removed from her character for all of the entirety of the first episode. There is a detail about her design that feels very Silco related, which would be her braids. And in this scene, that does, I think, reflect really well the images that we got of Silco before, that sense of drowning. And obviously there is that almost like baptism, you could say, that he has with her from before, and we get flashbacks to that. But him just sort of slowly sinking, that imagery is very much tied to a lot of what we got in season 1. So I liked the tie-in there, even though it was quite tragic, because now it's in relation to his death. But it makes sense as well, because he saw him almost having this feeling of drowning as a death in and of itself in his past. So for it to be official for him in this moment, I think was very intentional. But back to Jinx and her braids. The way that her braids in the water are almost circling around him in this moment, I thought was incredibly notable. And then as he's sinking, her hair sort of is toward him. And it's so sad, because I feel like there is this sense of, before, obviously, there is the name change. It was Powder and now it's Jinx. And Jinx is the person who's been influenced by him, whereas Powder was the person influenced by her sister. And now she, in a sense, has neither of them. Her and her sister are at odds, and Silco is now gone. So to have this piece of her, it feels like sort of clinging to him as he descends into the depths. While maybe that was just my interpretation of it, I thought that it really captured fantastically how much of her is also sort of sinking with him. But in this moment, there's a couple of quotes as well. We have her saying, "Someone put all those holes in you." I wasn't sure initially if the use of someone instead of her identifying herself was going to be her not recognizing that it was her that did this. But I think it's more so that she just doesn't want to put her name in association with that act. And I think it's just hard to process that. But I think with the other quote that I wanted to note, this one I'm paraphrasing, but she says something about the voices finally quieting. And I think there is finally this level of acceptance. You do see later, she mentions that she's quite good at making an orphan of herself, which was a very dark, tragic line. But I think there is sort of this acceptance, because the first time when she inadvertently killed her friends and her father figure was removed from her in that equation, her sister turned her back on her, or at least that's how she perceived it. In that moment, she, I don't think, could really accept her part that she played in that, even though it was accidental. Whereas here, I think she is starting to take ownership, and I'm perceiving it as that's why the voices are quieting, and she actually finally is having a sense of clarity in a way. Her just sort of wandering the city and looking at the power vacuum that has developed as a result of Silco being dead, she doesn't seem to be processing things from a place of numbness necessarily. I feel like she's finally seeing the undercity for what it is. And she's not just locked into herself, which I think is going to really play a significant role as we progress through the season, because I noted in season 1 that so much of her relationship with Silco and even her relationship with her memories and her past, it was so all-consuming in a sense that I don't think she really championed any particular cause. I think she just so badly craved affection and validation and to feel like she was worth something to someone. And because now, in a way, she doesn't really have anyone, she just sort of can put that aside to some degree, maybe not entirely, but it's not the thing that is at the root of sort of her motivations. Now, with that quieted, she can see and she can look around and recognize what everybody, in a way, is fighting over. Which leads us perfectly into the power vacuum. I did put in my notes, it's sort of like a battle of the dominatrix versus the Abe Lincoln wannabes, because the aesthetics of the different crime people in the undercity, they've got some choices that they have made, and I'm not gonna lie, I enjoyed the aesthetics of a lot of the different groups. I was so ready for that character Smeech to be out of the picture. I was like, please don't be a notable character for the rest of the season, because just the worst. Except for the design. The design was incredible. It was so well done, but I was ready immediately from that character's introduction for them to be put in their place. Somewhat like in season 1 when Silco is dealing with the other individuals who want to take him out, and I'm like, can we get rid of this person already? Because you start to develop a little bit of a morbid attachment to Silco and you sort of root for him, or at least I did sometimes. And so when you see these other characters coming into the picture, you're like, no, get out of here. And then they get dealt with rather quickly by Savika. And I do really like that it's not only Savika that takes him out, but sort of the parallels of when any one individual character within the undercity who wants to take advantage of Zon and who also does not really represent the ideals that Savika stands for, which is truly basically like the liberation of all of Zon. When there are characters who just see things as an opportunity for themselves, I like that she consistently doesn't stand with them. And you do see when they're trying to decide, these various different crime bosses, what they're going to do moving forward, because there's all this infighting. Savika's trying to convince them we need to band together. They don't know how to fight within the lanes, and we can stand up for ourselves. This character is just ready to sell Jinx out for his own gain, and that's that. So I love that you're already establishing this animosity between them. It sets up their fight toward the end of this episode so well. Before we get to that moment, though, you do see an interaction between Savika and Jinx. I knew immediately as soon as Savika walked in, and they've been mocking the fact that she lost her arm, I was like, Jinx will make her a new one. We know that. But regardless, she walks in to Silco's office. She's talking to him. Jinx has this line about like talking to the dead. You're weird and stuff. And I'm like, I like this self-awareness that we're starting to get and this dark humor we're getting out of Jinx's character. When she lands, though, on the desk and she's all curled up, it is nearly identical to how she did this in season 1, where she was almost ashamed before and she's sort of having to like answer to Silco like, oh, I got in trouble almost feeling. So I like that even though you are seeing, I'll call it growth, it doesn't feel like the right word for what Jinx is experiencing, change. We've seen change and a shift maybe in Jinx. Despite that, you still have that basically little girl that is present within her. So to see her sort of curled up on the desk in that way, and then her remembering, he always needed me to give him this injection. I love the detail of her posture representing her in those moments and her reverting right back to that. I do also like how Savika before was so cutting toward Jinx. That's not the part I like. I like, though, this transition where you're going from her being so cutting and her saying probably the worst things that you could say to Jinx with where she was before. Her being very critical of Jinx and her wanting Jinx out of the picture. She went from that to there just being sort of this level hearing each other out conversation, and I immediately was so excited at the potential of what these two could do together. From here, we do segue into Victor waking up. I actually thought we were going to save Victor waking up until a little bit later. I was so happy that this occurred as early as it did, but I was also so devastated when you're hearing the voices, and you hear Sky's voice, the loudest of them. That just upset me. And I wrote, Victor hears Sky, why? Because I just need Victor to be happy and have some peace. He's been through enough. He's gone through enough. Him and Vi, by the end of these 3 episodes, I was like, can the 2 of them just leave and just find paradise somewhere and dip? Because they've put in so much and they've taken in so much and it sucks. But anyway, so he wakes up. I was very sad. There's this conversation between him and Jace, and already Victor does not quite seem to be himself any longer. I'm very fearful of what this is going to mean for him. I was predicting by the end of season 1 that he would somehow be saved with the Hex Core, which is what we've seen so far. But moving forward past that point, I didn't really know what we were going to get. I didn't know if it was going to be one of those situations where there's this foreign entity that's within Victor and he's constantly warring with it. It doesn't quite feel like that. It feels like Victor is still somewhat present, but rather than there being this very clear, this is Victor, and then this is the Hex Core substance within him, the conscience of it, you could say, rather than them being separate, it very much feels like it's not only him that's meshed with it, but maybe a little bit of Sky and other people who somehow the magic has come in contact with. The fact that you hear these voices is a clue for that. And then on top of that, I also feel like a scene that we get later is potentially a clue as well. But regardless, Victor is still somewhat present in this form, it would seem. And this really heartbreaking scene between him and Jace. Jace is so overwhelmed with happiness to see that Victor is okay. And when Victor asks, "What am I?" and then Jace answers, "Alive," I'm so nervous because I feel like this too is foreshadowing as far as it's not really Victor that's alive necessarily. It's also maybe tapping into the fact that there's almost like a body that's been given to whatever was within the Hex Core and whatever motivates it. So I feel like that line had a lot more significance than just the obvious. And then also, Jace being so kind in this moment. I'm like, what is season 2 doing to me? Okay, like, why are you making me feel so bad for Jace? And when he comes over, I'm not opposed to it, by the way. I'm just saying, gosh, they're just, of course, immediately breaking my heart into pieces. And with him being so caring, and he's like, you must be cold. And then Victor is giving this very sort of cryptic, strange answer. And Jace putting the cloak over him, and you're like, oh my gosh, Jace being all sweet, and Victor being all mysterious, then him leaving and just basically breaking Jace's heart, because Jace is like, oh, but I know now, my place is here with you, and he's finally realizing all these other things that he got caught up with, that's not what he wants ultimately, and he's so ready, and then him and Victor part ways. I cannot wait, even though I'm pretty sure it's going to bum me out really hard. I can't wait to see more of Victor's character because he is potentially the most interesting character for me at this point. I also did appreciate, before I go away from this scene, that he finally vocalizes, "It killed Sky," and he says this to Jace. I don't know that Jace knows how to process this or what to make of this, because not a lot of time is spent on this confession that Victor just made. And Victor saying, basically, you should have stuck to our principles. And also him saying that it was his time. I wonder if there's going to be something a little bit more to that, and if it's perhaps a little more cryptic than it seems. After all this devastation, we did need some levity, and we got that with Heimerdinger being adorable with these little bubbles with the kids in this area that Echo has. And also, I love how much we have this conversation about principles and we go right into Echo, who I feel like really stands by his moral compass and consistently does. And you see this when he tells the other individual who is saying, we have so many people coming in, and Echo saying, it's because of all the fighting. And the other character is saying it's a security risk, and he's like, we're not turning anybody away. I love this character. I think they are so pure-hearted. They're so innovative. They're so creative. They're just such a phenomenal character, and they're cool. But we go from this to Heimerdinger saying, like, I think we need to figure out what's going on with the tree. And then they have this little mission, this spy mission sort of thing, and Echo's just kind of like walking and Heimerdinger's trying to sneak around. I'm like, what is this? It's so cute. This is too cute for this moment. Heimerdinger is so adorable. Anyway, so he's being all sneaky and he's really into it. And then when he gets into his office and gets caught and Jace is like, what are you doing here? I love that Heimerdinger said to him, like you've never done it, to Jace. What a great callback. And also what a great call out. Segueing out of the break-in scene, we do see Victor traversing through the undercity. And at first I thought it was just another phenomenal detail to include Huck as you're seeing the people who are sort of left to deal with what's going on. There's a lot of danger, there's a lot of fearfulness and uncertainty, both because the upper city, Piltover, is mad at Zahn, but on top of that there is this power vacuum and it's creating more violence. So I thought at first just having Huck appear was a great detail, even though we get the scene with Victor healing him a little bit after a few other moments. I do want to just kind of continue with this. It was so interesting to see how much they are not hiding at all this sort of Messiah-coded imagery with Victor. He looks fantastic. I feel the aesthetic of Victor's shift in his character design has been really wonderfully executed. The fact that we go from him having his cane before to basically something that's sort of representing the piece of him from before that I was describing that is still Victor, but also this potential foreign force that's within him that might be more so tied to these magician-like characters, these mages, by having the thing we've associated with Victor, the cane, turn into what is basically like a staff, and having him walk around and have this cloak. Also, it mirrors what we've seen of magic users before, like the one in Jace's memory. I feel like all of that, it feels like Victor, but it feels like something else, is so good. And then you do see him healing Huck. And that scene, the way that it looked like a painting, obviously Arcane is animated great. And there's so many moments that you could say look like a painting. But this one, because of how much his entire design feels Messiah-like, and then of course you get the healing and you have them basically bowing to him and almost like disciples. I feel very much that they put a little bit more effort into making the scene as you're sort of panning out look like a painting, and the way in which that evokes something in a lot of the viewers. I am so nervous though, because it does have this feeling of pureness to it. He's just going to go around and heal people. But I don't know that the magic that is used is entirely pure in its essence. I feel like it also takes. We saw that obviously with him before, because there was it helping him be able to walk and then to run. But then very quickly after, it consumed Sky. So I don't think that it's just going to remain as a give. I think it's going to be this give and take, and we just haven't seen the take portion yet. So that we have yet to see. I am looking forward to how that's going to play out. But one additional detail about this moment is when he goes to heal Huck, there are two things. One, the way that his eyes sort of flicker between different colors, it's not the most obvious. It almost looks like it's a capturing of the light. To me, it looks like a fracturing of light, and a fracturing of light in the way that was somewhat shaped like the hex core before. And then when he sees Sky, he looked so happy in that moment, and I was so conflicted because I felt kind of happy, also sad because Sky is dead and that sucks. But then on top of that, there is this little feeling of dread that this is gonna get out of hand. I'm fearful that everybody he ends up coming in contact with in the same way that he has with Huck, that they're gonna have some piece almost of the Arcane imprinted on them, and then the Arcane can use them. So I'm really fearful of what's to come with that, and what's to come of Victor himself. Returning to the other scenes, though, that occurred within this episode, we see that Vi and Caitlyn and the others have entered the Undercity, and they are after Jinx. She has returned to this hideout where they used to play games when they were kids. She's making this arm for Savika. And I really like that when you see the characters come into this area, at first Jinx doesn't quite know that it's Vi. And when Vi finds the goggles and Jinx cries over that moment, I think you could say she cries because she realizes how far Vi has not only not lost herself, but what Vi is willing to do and what she's willing to become. I think there is a sadness for Jinx because in the same way that we very overtly are constantly told that Powder is gone, there's only Jinx now. I think in a way, Jinx is seeing something similar in Vi, which is that you hated them, and now she would probably perceive it as you've become them because you're just that desperate. But also, the other layer to this is you're that desperate to find me and to get me, basically. And I imagine there's a lot of warring feelings occurring within her in this moment. And I want to compliment I'm complimenting most of this. Oftentimes, Jinx, to put it lightly, comes across rather flippant, and she goes back and forth between flippant and angry, but you don't really see her look entirely terrified very often, not since she was Powder, you could say. And I do feel like because you have this substance in the air that is affecting her, it's making her cough, it's obviously affecting her eyes, I think it's easy to perceive her physicality in this moment as just a reaction to what's in the air. But I think she's genuinely afraid and emotional in this moment. And I want to compliment this because it also reflects something I think season 1 did really well with Silco, which is that so often when we get these intimidating crime boss-like characters, no matter what the situation is, those characters are always cool, calm, and collected, and they never seem like they experience real human fear. But you see in the moment where you don't know if Sevika is going to betray Silco, and instead she ends up staying loyal to him, he is out of breath. He is breathing very heavy in that moment, and he seemed genuinely terrified. His eyes were wider. And I like that here you're seeing something similar happen with Jinx. Yes, she oftentimes is very over the top, and sometimes when she's in dangerous situations or when she's causing harm and should be more horrified at what's occurring, she oftentimes seems very, lost in her head and doesn't really perceive what's happening around her and process it. But here, I think this adds to the idea that she is feeling more clarity with a lot of things because she seems genuinely choked up, no pun intended, and afraid in this moment. Then we segue into such a great action scene, and I like the campiness of it and the juxtaposition of Jinx and the fact that she is so chaotic with Sevika, who is rather severe and serious. And we get this new arm, it of course has Jinx's spin on it, and it's sort of ridiculous. I'm very jealous of the fans of the games because as somebody who is a fan of video games, I am jealous first off because this is the best adaptation from a video game franchise pretty much that I can think of, so I'm very jealous just from that alone. But also the excitement that all of you must feel when you get these Easter eggs, and I feel like this is one of those moments with the sort of slots within the arm. Also, Jinx just kind of vibing to the music that she put, and Sevika being so annoyed by it was fun. That was a lot of fun. It's a very campy fight scene, as I said, and I was very much enjoying it. But I also love the parallel from season 1 to here, where when Vi first comes back to the lanes and she confronts Sevika, she knees her in the face, and then Sevika has this very dramatic removal of her cloak, and then she's got this arm. And you have almost the same exact frame when she does this here, except for now it's the arm that Jinx made her, and I put in my notes, cloak removal part 2, because I was so pumped in this moment. That scene was a lot of fun, and I was also ready for Smeech to be out of the picture, so I was pumped that he was. And then the last thing I'll note for this episode was when you have Sevika and Jinx interacting, and Sevika's like, I didn't ask you to do this, why'd you do this? And she said, it was something I could fix. And I feel like, sadly, that's just so much of what she's always wanted. She's just wanted to tinker, she's just wanted to be a part of something, she's wanted to help actually progress things, and she's sort of been stuck for so long. And I think this adds additionally to the idea of her having more clarity because she's seeing now something that she can fix that isn't necessarily rooted in her getting validation. It's just something genuinely like, I saw something that was a problem and I knew I could contribute to fixing it, so I did. Sadly though, we do get to episode 3, which is titled Finally Got the Name Right. We open with this amazing comic book look. I really appreciate how much they have given to different art styles and showcase them. You see it, I think, the most with Echo's design and aesthetic, with the opening of, I believe, episode 7 in season 1, and I like that we're getting more of that here. I can see this being something maybe other people don't like as much and they feel like they would not lean into it as much, but I feel like this is what makes this show very creative and different. It already has an amazing animation style, but to then incorporate these other moments, as I said, there's sort of the funeral scene that was done very artistically. This is a good way to not only show how this task force has been navigating through the undercity, but also providing this explanation about what Caitlyn's family and their legacy really entailed. It did it in a way where it kind of went over it quickly, it gave you the information you needed, and it was artistic and visually pleasing. Also got us caught up. It didn't show them having to navigate through all of these different areas. It just sort of established, here's where we are, and then this is where we're going to move forward from. But before we go further into that, we do get a scene with Ambessa. We specifically see her with Amora. A lot of this season, in my opinion, is trying to set up, I think, just how serious the threat of the Arcane is. So I think a lot of Heimerdinger's fears are going to be realized within this season, but we know, many of us, that after season 2, that's it for this story. There will be a wrap on this story, and then we're going to get something else. And I have a feeling that some of these pieces that we're getting are hints of what's to come and the different areas potentially that we'll be exploring. Amora's magic looks like nothing that we've seen thus far. I liked it a lot. I thought it was really interesting. I think that it's pretty cool that the opening of the entire show, meaning the opening credits that are played, that you do see this sort of flower and Ambessa holding it, and then later you see Mel holding it. So I think that it's really foreshadowing fantastically what's to come with how there's a threat between Ambessa and whatever these individuals are representing. Can't comment too much more though on whatever's transpiring here, as I don't really know the conclusion to it or what it all means. I knew from season 1 when Ambessa was talking about how Mel's brother crossed the wrong people that was going to play a role. I just didn't know how much. And ultimately, I still don't quite know how much, but I look forward to seeing how that plays out. We do revisit Vi and Caitlyn though, and we do have a moment between them where Vi is really exposing a very vulnerable side to her when she tells Caitlyn, everybody in my life has changed, please don't change. And you do finally have a moment with them, which is exciting and you're kind of happy, but at the same time you're like, okay, but also I just know that everything's gonna go poorly. So in a way, in hindsight, the scene is even sadder because you're like, oh, they're so close to finding each other, and if their circumstances were different, maybe they could have joy and happiness, but Vi can't have any. Nobody gives her anything. Can they stop being so terrible to her? I'm sorry, I'm getting worked up. We do return after all of the intensity that has been occurring in the first portion of this episode to the levity and more magic-oriented plotline that relates to Jace, Heimerdinger, and Echo. I don't know that I ever would have expected Echo and Jace to be characters that would cross paths in a meaningful way. Now that they have, I'm quite enjoying their interactions, and I'm also really appreciating getting additional information on how the magic works. I do think a lot of us who are fans of fantasy stories, we don't always need a hard magic system that has very clear rules and limitations, but it does allow for us to have more understanding, and oftentimes more understanding comes better established stakes, which I think it was necessary to establish here before things start to get really out of hand, as once they do start to get out of hand, which is very much what it seems like the path, the trajectory of this is going toward. But if you don't have any inclination how anything works, it just sort of feels like everything comes out of nowhere. So to somewhat ground us here, both through Echo, but also just in general, by having some explanation for the Hex Core and Arcane in general, I think was very needed. I also just in general liked the idea of it and how Jace explained it. I think the idea of there being clear commands versus there being additional layers to almost this language, I thought was really well explained, and I just came away from it being like, wow, that still feels like magic, because sometimes when we do get the rules and limitations, if they're too confined, it starts to not feel magical anymore. That is such a difficult thing to balance, and I think that we are starting to do that very well. There is a brief moment between Mel and Alora. We also had a scene with Ambessa and the other councilmen, so there's a lot of intrigue that is going on with these characters, which it feels very fitting for them. And I kind of like that you're seeing sort of Mel being at odds with her mother. She's trying to understand her. You do see Ambessa earlier saying we still need Mel to basically be our enemy in a sense. And I don't quite know the entirety of what is occurring with that, but I am very much enjoying this sort of political intrigue side of their plotline. I don't have all that many notes for the rest of this episode because I was so sucked in to everything that was happening. You have simultaneously the standoff between Vi and Jinx, which I was surprised occurred as early as episode 3. And while this is occurring, you have Jace and Heimerdinger and Echo going down to where this collection of magic, we'll say, is being stored, this almost like engine, and there being some really bizarre things that are occurring there, which is sort of making the Hex weapons act up during this fight. The scene was executed brilliantly. I was incredibly engaged, very edge of your seat. And then you're also now having the emotional stakes, not just with Vi and her sister, but also Caitlyn, where you can just see her being right on the edge, and she's ready. Vi, before she even started the fight, said if you get a shot, take it. She did shoot off her finger, which a lot of us were wondering about with that particular poster, because it seemed like she had a finger that was a little different than the others. So, okay, now we have the explanation of how that happened. But then you see her so ready to take another shot when that little child shows up. And a number of things to note here. First off, Vi immediately stops as soon as there's a kid in the picture, because Vi ultimately is not willing to go through people to try to get to her sister. You could argue that a lot of what she's been doing with how they're using that, I'm going to call it like that poison, to get through the undercity, obviously that's blurring some lines, if not just crossing some lines. It seems like they're trying to use it strategically, whereas then you see Jinx trying to use it strategically. So again, there are a lot of debates, of course, that you could have about the morality of that. But when there's a person right directly in front of her who is innocent, you see Vi stops, and it's not worth it in that moment for her. And then you also see Jinx stop. And in the past, I think Jinx, not that she wanted anybody to get hurt, but it was almost like she was unaware of her surroundings to a certain degree. And now it's like she stops too. And she even seems like she doesn't want something to happen. So you have this standstill. Caitlyn comes into the picture, and Vi is the one that stops her from shooting them because she's concerned that she's going to miss and hit the child. Savika has this explosion go off, and Jinx seems like she doesn't want it, which is devastating because it kind of seemed like once again, it's like that moment in season 1 when Vi and Jinx are finally reunited, and then the firelights show up and you're like, dang it, what if they had never shown up? And I feel like it's that same feeling again in this moment. But regardless, you see that they get separated. There is this emotional moment where it is finally addressed, where the animation I noted before and how it seemed like Caitlyn was almost acting like Jinx, and you see Vi even say to her, because Caitlyn is lashing out, she's saying, I should have known, it's her blood in your veins, and Vi comes back with, then why are you acting like her? And then when Caitlyn hurts her physically and emotionally and then walks away, and Vi crying, oh my gosh, because we've had so many Vi crying moments. She's usually crying like in anger and in anguish, but this was such like a softer, deeper, more vulnerable cry, if that's even possible. It was in its own separate category. I feel like the crying here, which is not just a compliment to the team for wanting this to come across differently than the ways that she's been hurt before, but also a compliment to the acting to be able to evoke something different in this crying than in the other crying moments with Vi. But just that sense of loss. This is why I was saying before, can Vi have nothing? I mean, like, are you serious? She's trying so hard. She jumps in. She often tries to help people where she can. She's already having to question a lot of what she stands for, the very idea of being an enforcer, essentially, and how devastating that is for her, and how it connects to her past. And then also, speaking of her past, she's trying to have to seek out her sister who has caused all this harm. Her sister has hurt this person that she cares about, meaning Caitlyn, and she's just been through it. And then Caitlyn hurts her, and you're like, no, why? Why are we taking so much away from Vi? It's just so heartbreaking. And then you see what I noted before about how Ambessa saw something in Caitlyn, and so she selects her to basically lead this martial law that I knew she was gonna do. I knew this was coming from basically the moment she was introduced in season 1, so I'm really excited to see this play out. And you have Caitlyn sort of take up the mantle. I do really appreciate that character that was silently basically comforting Vi before walks away, just basically disgusted, like, no, I'm not going to be a part of this. I'm pretty nervous about this. And speaking of nervous, we'll get to the doctor, because I have avoided talking about the doctor this entire time. But the last thing I'll note before I get into the doctor comments is that Mbessa, she once again proves where Mel got her manipulation tactics from, because when she tells Caitlyn, your mother will have justice, I swear it, she could not have, I think, said anything else that would have rang truer to Caitlyn and would have convinced her. She so well is using her in this moment, and it's just heartbreaking. I do not want to see Caitlyn go down this road. I wish she would step back for a moment and recognize that she is too consumed right now with too many different warring emotions, and she's not thinking the way she should be. So Mbessa has proven to be a fantastic, I'm just going to call her a villain. I think she's proving to be a fantastically written villain, which I kind of feel we needed after how well Silco was written. I feel that we needed that character within this season. We're getting it very much in Mbessa. Now getting to the doctor. Every episode ended with a snippet of him, so I thought it would be fitting to end this entire discussion discussing him. We do see him looking through his locket, and this locket, I'm very much assuming, has the picture of his daughter. You hear him say to Silco in season 1, I once too had a daughter. And so I think that locket has a picture of her. He also seems very keen on keeping that one, I don't know what it was called, I'm forgetting, but there's that little creature that when Victor was small he saw, and then it got really big and it looked very sickly, but he kept talking about we must keep it alive. He seems like he's set on somehow trying to make something happen where he can maybe save his daughter, restore something related to his daughter, so we'll see with that. But there keeps being all this dog/wolf imagery with him, and I talked about in season 1 how they called Vander the Hound of the Underground, and I'm like, dude, if they have somehow mixed Vander all up and he is going to become this weapon within Zaun, and then if Vi is going to have to confront him and fight him, I'm like, stop doing that to her. Leave her alone, please. I feel like I can't handle it, and it's not even real, and it's not happening to me. The idea of that happening to this character, I'm like, stop, no. So I'm very scared. I am predicting, I've already kind of laid out things I'm looking forward to seeing, and maybe some predictions throughout the discussion, but I am very nervous that the way that this next act is going to play out with Vi in particular is that she is going to be devastated and broken and basically be giving up, if you will. And then maybe she's finally going to kind of rally herself back up. And then it's going to be Vander in this weapon form. And then she's going to have to fight him after finally sort of picking herself back up again. And we're just going to re-traumatize her. But there's a tiny part of me that hopes that somehow that is going to bring her and Jinx together, maybe? I don't know. I don't know. I'm at a loss. I just can't take any more heartache for Vi. It's devastating me. If you heard my dog grumble, she can't handle it either. She's also bumming hard. This was so good. This is everything I was hoping for with the introduction of this second season. I can't wait for acts 2 and 3. Let me know what your predictions are. I'm sure there are so many other details that I didn't mention or maybe I didn't notice. So if you want to elaborate on some other things, I would love to see it. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.